My name is Peter Young, and I'm the Yale class of 1974, Brantford, and I want to welcome you to the 27th Yale Career Panel that started 6 years ago, and we've also had 4 Yale Career Fireside Chats that are not focused on professions, but focused on career issues, such as serving on boards, managing major career changes, and so forth. This all started because there are a number of us who realized that although Yale does a great job of educating you, and the Career Services Office helps you meet with recruiters and so forth, that it's harder to get sort of candid views of each profession. And TV doesn't help. So if you watch shows about being a lawyer, you win a case every 15 minutes. The doctor ones are fantastic. You save everyone. And I really love all the ones, NCIS and Bones. And it's amazing how many people are now studying forensic science under the illusion that their job, they'll have the LED screens and, all these things. But if you talk to someone who is actually in the forensic department of the New York Police Department, they'll explain to you it's not quite the same. So our mission really is to just help, not to have a bias, positive or negative, but rather to help those of you who are in the audience online, but also here, present here, to get a kind of a balanced view about various issues surrounding a particular profession. I have here Trish Takimoto, who was one of the co-founders of the series, and I want to thank the other people who've worked with us, whether it's the AYA or the Yale Office of Career Strategies or School of Management or Junior Class Council, all those, and the Asian American Alumni Association of Yale, all of whom have worked together with us to promote and also to suggest ideas. So with that, what I'd like to do is just talk to you about the format, introduce our panelists. The format's pretty straightforward. We have 3 panelists. I'm the moderator. There's one panelist who is trying to log in, so hopefully he'll
might be
join.
Texting me right now.
Maybe he'll be joining. Let's see if he's on. Let's see if he's here.
He says, "I'm here."
There we go. Okay, he is on. So we'll now add him on. Okay, here we go.
Hey.
There we go. Okay, and so first what I'll do is I'll introduce the panelists, and then what we're going to do is we'll go through a series of questions that you saw in the invitation, really talking about what is it like, what kind of people tend to do well or not do well, and so forth. And we want to make sure that we leave about 15 minutes at least at the end for people to ask questions. The people who are here in person, they can just raise their hands and we'll call on them. Those of you who are online, all you have to do is just type in your question using the chat function at the bottom, and then all of us are going to be able to see it and we'll be able to answer the question. The last thing I want to say is that there is a website called yalecareerpanels.com, and on that website you'll find 2 things. One is the list of upcoming events, but also we have the recordings of about 27 out of the 30 panels and fireside chats that we've had over the last 6 years. So if you want to see the one on drama and film, or architecture, or on government service, so forth, all you have to do is go there, click on it, and you'll be able to see the video. So, and this is being recorded, so it too will be up and running after a few days on that website. So with that, let me start out by really introducing our 3 panelists. We have John Bittner, who is broadcasting from somewhere outdoors, right? So hopefully it won't rain. We have Diana Liu, who is broadcasting from sunny New Haven, right, and the School of Management. And we have Zach Bringberger's here with me here in New York in my office. So with that, we'd like to start and just have each person really just talk briefly for a few minutes about what they're doing, but also their connection to this topic of startups. Everyone's bio is on the invitation, so you don't need to recite everything, but maybe we can really start off. John, do you want to start off? I'll unmute you. There we go. If you could
Sure.
maybe say a few words about your background and your startup involvement.
Yeah. Hi, I'm John Bittner. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Splitwise. I've been working on Splitwise for maybe, like 6 years now. Is that right? As my full-time startup. Splitwise helps millions of people keep track of shared expenses with their friends, family, loved ones, travelers, enemies, you name it. And I didn't do much entrepreneurial stuff while I was at Yale as an undergrad in 2007, but I started Splitwise when I was in graduate school in 2011, first as a side project, and it turned into my full-time gig in 2012. And I previously was studying astrophysics at Harvard.
And John is a repeat panelist because he was on a panel in 2012, I believe, right?
Yeah, something like that.
It was on entrepreneurism. So if you want to see the before and after, you can just watch the one that he did in 2012. In no particular order, Diana, do you want to talk about yourself and your connection with startup?
Sure. So I'm following John. Basically, I was him in his previous panel. I'm just starting out with entrepreneurship. I'm a second year at the School of Management right now and leading a startup on pipe crawling robots and data analytics for the oil and gas industry. Prior to SOM, I was an engineer with Exxon. And one of the reasons that I went to Yale was to essentially make this product that we were trying to use in the refineries. So we are just starting out. We're working on closing a seed round right now, knock on wood, and we're beginning some field tests soon.
And can you just describe what your product that you're developing, what it does? I've heard it from you.
Sure.
It's terrific.
It's a pipe crawling robot. So essentially, it crawls along any of the refinery pipes, and in oil and gas refineries, it's just hundreds of thousands of miles of piping that they're currently inspecting manually. So what we're trying to do is automate it. We're going to put a robot up there that can crawl longitudinally and go circumferentially around the pipe at once. And as it's going, it's going to be able to figure out what thickness the pipe is at all points. And from that data, we're going to be able to create a software platform that will allow these refiners to not only plan their maintenance better, but to implement predictive analytics that they really want to use, but currently cannot.
Yeah. Well, it's a huge potential because that's a big problem. And when you're finished to that, I would appreciate it if you could deal with pipes in co-op buildings in New York City.
Of course. I'm pretty sure this could be adapted to anything, starting with oil and gas.
Yeah,
but
I guarantee you it's a big problem, right? Zach, do you want to comment?
Yeah. So my name is Zach O'Malley Greenberg. I'm a senior editor at Forbes. I cover the business of media and entertainment with a particular focus on hip hop. And I've written, my third book is actually coming out on Tuesday. It's called Three Kings, and it's about the rise of Jay-Z, Diddy, Dr. Dre, and hip hop as a multi-billion-dollar business. And my product I can actually show you in real life is this thing. Yeah, so really, I'm not necessarily an entrepreneur myself, although John and I, he didn't tell you, but we were business managers of Out of the Blue, the Yale a cappella group, during our time. So we did have a bit of a business together, I would say, in that regard. But mostly I just write about other people's businesses rather than starting my own. And at Forbes, I've profiled entrepreneurs ranging from Richard Branson to Katy Perry to Ashton Kutcher to Diddy, all entrepreneurs in different ways in their own right, and kind of bring that angle hopefully to our panel. And
in my case, this is an unusual case where only every once in a while am I connected to the topic. I run an investment bank, so the investment banking ones I can comment, but I also happen to have had a a long association with the Yale Entrepreneurial Institute. So I've been a mentor of many startups of Yale students and Yale graduates. So I'll comment a little bit from my experience seeing what a lot of these companies have gone through and students have gone through and alumni. So I'll be able to comment, from that experience. So maybe let's start out and just say, startups are really kind of a hot topic, and everybody's excited about it, and there are all these incubators and so forth. And I think a lot of young people are choosing a startup route rather than joining large corporations, and probably, sometimes for the right reasons, sometimes maybe not for the right reasons. But maybe what we can do is start out by talking about, what is the right way to look about startups? Take the recruiting hat away, and so I know you guys are excited about what you're doing, but if you were like talking to a friend and sort of just saying, okay, let me give you the honest view of what startups are all about, where they headed, so forth. What would you say? So, John, do you want to start out with that? Because I'm sure you've given advice to probably a lot of people, right?
Yeah. Yes. I have a lot of feelings about that question, and I'm curious to hear what Diana has to say as well. I mean, for me, I think I've had friends ask me about startup paths in the past, and I certainly, for anyone who's interested in it, I wouldn't tell them categorically do it or categorically don't do it. And it's a different question too, whether it's about joining a startup or starting a startup. And obviously I've only done one of those things. I started Splitwise many years ago. I've never worked for someone else's startup, but I think that it can be really different. And I think there's not like startups as a thing per se. I mean, there's a culture of working for startups and starting startups in, say, San Francisco or New York that can be kind of similar, but at the end of the day, startups, there's so many startups right now, and they're all so different and have such different cultures, experiences, tolerances for risk. I guess, Peter, just to clarify your question, are you asking from the point of view for someone who wants to start a startup or someone who wants to join one?
No, I'm trying to ask it from a big picture point of view, which is just startups generally as a group of activities, as opposed to we'll get into the question of who should be in a startup or not later individually.
Sure.
But I mean, as an example, when people asked, we had this on legal, people said, well, look, the legal profession is in a mature state. It's going through some turmoil because there's too many lawyers. It now takes 12 years to be a partner, but the probability of being partner has gone down. It used to be 5 years, and there's a lot of issues about fees that law firms are charging. On the other hand, it's an important area, critical to the function.
I see what you mean. I see what you mean.
So it's a big picture. That's a big picture description of the legal profession, right?
Right. Okay. So at the highest level for me, I think that startups right now are being powered by a lot of really cheap capital, a lot of really awesome opportunity in terms of mobile apps, drones, just a shout out, or like, and just the fact that so many traditional businesses really wanted to forget that technology was changing things. So there's just been sort of a wave and a flurry of activity over the last, let's say since 2006 or 2005. So many interesting businesses being started with all of this direct access to consumers and new technology and cheap consumer technology like cameras and such. So there's been just an amazing wave, and I think that we are in a sort of a special window. If you gave an example with the legal profession, from my point of view, if you look at, like, say, the way, and I'm no expert on this history, but if, like, what was happening in auto, like with cars, in the United States, maybe 100 years ago or 80 years ago, that was a special window too. And now things have sort of consolidated, and we can almost see already who the oligopoly is going to be, right? We've got our Googles and our Facebooks and our Apples, and big tech is definitely still very much a thing. But, for maybe, who knows how long the window will stay open, but for now, there's just a lot of really exciting capital and opportunity in starting new companies. because there are so many industries that tech hasn't touched yet. So that's kind of like my super high level. And my example is of course, in the finance industry.
Diana, your big picture observations, and obviously you're also surrounded by a lot of other entrepreneurs at your school, so you also see some patterns as well, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm not going to repeat anything John said, but I completely agree with everything he said, especially about the tech. I think a lot of my classmates are actually focused on tech and just more mobile-based products. So I'm going to try to give a different view, having come from a big company and worked for probably one of the biggest ones historically. I think a lot of younger people are looking more at startups instead of going to a big firm. And I don't know if that's a good or bad idea either way. I think it depends on the person. I know you said we're going to get into that later. But one thing that I think also might be interesting for people who want to do startups is if you go to a big company first, you really get to see problems that industries face that, if you're coming straight out of school, you might not realize that, they have these issues. So people who want to go into startups, one option is to work for a company first, learn how, an industry works, and then devise something that solves the problem, which is how I accidentally came across this idea. And that being said, I do think a lot of amazing products are also solved by people just seeing tech is growing. How can you implement it to every part of the world that's brand new? So, and another thing that I learned at SOM was there's another group of startups, more search funds, just like starting small businesses that I think doesn't get enough publicity nowadays. A lot of entrepreneurs aren't really looking for the high growth firms, to start. They're trying to start a small company, something more of a lifestyle brand. And I don't think that gets enough credit sometimes. And some of them are amazing entrepreneurs too.
Yeah. Zach, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think one thing from my view that I'm seeing, at least, from the Forbes angle, especially comparing this, sort of tech boom to the Web 1.0 boom, is that first time around, everybody wanted to have an IPO, right? It's like, how fast can we get to the IPO? And it then became easy for average people to invest in these hot new companies. And of course, that didn't work out so well for most of them during the first boom. The second time around, you see a lot of these companies, Airbnb, Uber, Spotify, and so forth, putting off the IPO as long as humanly possible, which delays the time that it makes it harder for, obviously, if you're just a regular investor, you can't go buy shares of Spotify because it's not publicly traded. You can't buy shares of Uber because it's not publicly traded. Whereas in 1.0, these companies would have already been public. People could have invested in them if they felt interested. So, from my perspective, especially covering the media and entertainment side of things, what you're seeing is, some of the entertainers even start to leverage their fame by getting stakes in startups, by saying, well, hey, I'm Ashton Kutcher and I want to put, $100,000 into Uber or whatever it is. And these companies are really interested in having people who are well known, who have social followings that can boost their companies and who can make introductions to other strategic investors or, other people that it behooves them to have an association with. So, it's sort of, in a way, Web 2.0, whatever you want to call it, whatever we're going through now, it's, more intertwined with the overall economy and these companies seem to have more staying power. But it's also, in some ways, the democratization of it is less so because you can't just go invest in Uber if you're a simple retail investor. So that's definitely one angle that I always try to look at too.
Yeah, I'll make a couple others. And first of all, I think that you first have to just sort of say, is this a good business I'm trying to start? And I'm amazed at how many people do startups and actually never, if I say, well, tell me the nature of your business, why you have a competitive advantage, how you're going to be able to maintain it, and how you're going to raise your money principally through your customer and not having to raise equity. Because, see, I was at J.H. Whitney, the Whitney family venture firm, the oldest venture firm in this country. It started in 1946. And Benno Schmidt, who was a senior partner, he had a couple of philosophies that were terrific. One of which is, if you start a business, you have to have a competitive advantage. And number two, all things equal, it's so hard to start up a company. Try to solve a big problem, not a small problem, because but one where you can win, where you can have a competitive advantage. And the other is you've got to have a situation where something is changing in your favor. Because it's just like, if you want to do a startup, compete with ExxonMobil, good luck, right? I mean, they have so many resources being an oil company, right? It would be tough. So doing a startup in oil, may or may not make sense, but doing a startup where something is changing, right, in your favor, but you have a leg up in that area, right? So that's why things like, I talked to a guy who's doing a delivery service for Chinese dumplings, okay? So I said, tell me the economics. So he went down the economics. Here's how much it costs to make a dumpling, blah, blah, blah. Here's the delivery cost. And we make 1.5 cents per order. And I said, you're never going to succeed, right? If the price of scallions goes up slightly, you're going to lose money, right? And you're competing against all these Chinese restaurants who deliver with people on bicycles, right? So I said, you might have happy customers, but you're never going to make money, right? He said, I never thought of it that way. And by the way, he stopped doing it, right? So you have to first start and say, is this a good business? But if it's a startup, you have to have more than just it's a good business. You have to have a reason why you could succeed, because the energy it takes to get something started from scratch is huge compared to keeping a business going or growing something that exists, right? So you got to ask yourself those questions. Or if someone's asking you to join their startup, you should ask them to answer those questions too, right? So, John, you were coming?
Yeah, I was about to latch on to something you just said, which is if you're going to join a startup, you should ask those questions. Is a really good piece of advice. I think probably the number one piece of advice I've given people who are thinking about joining a startup or starting one is to, especially for people who are thinking about joining one as a co-founder, as an employee, is to ask really hard questions in your interviews and to challenge the person. In part because it will make you seem smarter, because people are in the startups, I'd say, at least in my experience, are usually impressed if people ask good, hard questions, and also because the answers are really important. I think one thing I've learned from switching, being on this side of the table where you are trying to hire people for a startup, is that most people don't ask good enough questions and don't ask good, hard questions that, you don't want to join there are definitely people that you join a startup and the startup dies, 3 months, 6 months later. So it can be nice to if you can find a startup that's willing to be transparent with you, and also that you believe in. I mean, that's very valuable. And to get your ability to assess, at least what is the plan that they're doing, where is the funding coming from, if it's some investor that you've never heard of and it's kind of confusing and they're not making money, that could be challenging. So it's just something to think about, and whether you're planning to enter the sort of tech startup industry as an employee or as a startup founder, to just kind of learning how to do that kind of diligence about companies and competitors is really valuable. Anyway.
Let me ask everyone, all three panelists, which is, what are the pros and cons of being involved with a startup, maybe with a group of people from scratch, versus joining an existing startup that may have started 1, 2, 3 years before? What are the pros and cons for doing one or the other, assuming the business model in both cases is about the same, right, in terms of likelihood of success? Diana, you referred to that, so maybe you can start.
Sure. So I have never joined a startup, so take what I say about that with a grain of salt. It's more looking from the outside in. But I think one of the things, if you're joining as one of the first members or co-founder, is you really get to have multiple jobs or roles. So you're more like a jack of all trades than someone who can come in and, hey, I'm really good at marketing. I only want to do marketing, or I only want to do finance. So for someone who knows what they want to do and doesn't really want to step outside that zone, it might be a little bit better to work for a more established startup versus someone who's okay not knowing what they're going to be doing the next day or the next week. That might be a better one to, be one of the earlier employees. And I think another thing is when starting out, you have to be more okay with change and uncertainty. And what you sign up for one day might be very different than where the company is going in the next month. And you just sort of have to be okay with that. Whereas if you're a little bit later, my guess is, it's a lot more laid out, not necessarily that they won't pivot, but it's not as quick pivots. And I defer to John on this. He's definitely more experienced on this part.
No, I was just going to upvote what you were saying, Diana. I think that's great. I think if you're joining a startup as one of the first few employees, or certainly as a co-founder, things are probably going to change a lot. And so even if there's a great sounding answer to all of the questions that Peter laid out, that all might be totally wrong. So it's maybe more important to like the people and trust the people and trust their integrity, that sort of thing. Just so that you know that if you're going to go on a crazy ride, you're going on it with the right people, and that they're not going to lie to you, and that's stuff that's real life. But yeah, definitely upvoting. Startups are great for generalists. The earlier, the better. Don't join a startup if you want to be the best model optimizer or something, unless that's exactly what the startup does. I don't know. It's just too scary to it's great advice.
Yeah, I would jump in and say, and maybe this is stating the obvious, but it's also about, your personal risk tolerance and, are you willing to live on ramen noodles for 2 years? If you are, and to put a big bet on yourself, on your company.
Ramen is pretty good, by the way.
Hey,
don't criticize ramen.
Don't
criticize ramen. There are a lot of ramen fans out
very good
there.
ramen. But, yeah, I mean, the first couple of years, obviously, if you're starting your own company, or if you're one of the first founders, you're paying yourself very little, or you're being paid very little, and then the upside comes in the equity that you get. If you join a more mature startup, obviously, maybe you get paid more guaranteed, but you get a much smaller amount of equity. So it kind of it comes down to what stage of your life are you at? Or are you willing to kind of gut it out for a while, and if you really believe in something, or do you need them to be a little more comfortable? I think those are that's a big consideration point.
Yeah, and I to quote again Benner Smith, one of his favorite phrases to piggyback off what Diana said is that the only thing that's better than learning from your mistakes is learning from the mistakes of other people, which I think is a brilliant comment. He didn't say, he said he doesn't, I don't say, I don't think one is necessarily always the one you want to do, but learning from your own mistakes is a little more painful than watching others for a while and then learning from them. When I started Younger Partners, I talked to 8 people who started boutique investment banks, and they were very generous in telling me, hey, here's what you should do, and here's what you do, and here's what everyone does, which is create a traditional partnership, but here's why it really becomes a mess, right? And so I was very fortunate to get their advice, and it really helped me, because a number of things that I would have automatically have done, right, would have been a big mistake. By the way, there's one thing I forgot to say at the very beginning of this that I always do say is the one thing this panel will not do is help you do your self-assessment, right? So the one thing you should do is make sure, and I guess Zach is really referring to that, like risk profile, whatever, which is know yourself, but talk to someone who knows enough about you so that they know you a little bit, but who's willing to be honest with you about what you're really like. Because the reality is, startup and entrepreneurism is really not for everyone, right? It fits some people like a glove, and for other people, it's the world's biggest mistake, right? And so try to do some self-assessment, but with someone who knows something about you, right? Because if you just go to a stranger, they don't know you. They may be very wise about people and careers, but they have no idea what you're like. So try to do that. And one thing's for sure is none of us are good at self-assessment by ourselves, right? We're the least objective, right? About ourselves. So that's really bad, right? So you got to find your own way of doing that. Because at the end of the day, you could have the best advice from Diana, Zach, and John, but if you haven't figured out that you fit or don't fit, their advice is going to be meaningless, right, for you. On that note, let's segue into this question of what are observations about people who tend to do well or fit well into startups, and people who really don't by virtue of their skills or their personality or their risk tolerance and so forth. So I'll let any of the panelists comment about that.
I can start if y'all want.
Obviously, it's go to Exxon or for a really large company and then do a startup, right? Well, John,
Yes,
maybe, because
obviously the right path.
yeah, you've been involved for a while. You've seen people who have either succeeded or crashed and burned, right? So maybe can you generalize a little bit about traits that that you've noticed that seem to either cause people to be the wrong type for startups or the right type?
Me?
Me
Yeah,
or John?
yeah, John.
Okay. You know, maybe, are you still there? Okay, great. Yeah. Sorry, just everything's great. Generalizing about people is really hard, and just to take a slightly heterodox view, Peter, I think that lots of different kinds of people can be different kinds of entrepreneurs, and startups in particular. I don't notice a lot of patterns. I think that it's very tricky. Definitely tolerance for risk. I certainly agree with Zach said that earlier. And I guess I would say listening well is like a really important skill. Like if you're the kind of person who, or just being willing to be wrong. I used to study science, physics, as maybe I mentioned at the top, and I do think there's like an element to where like just being willing to be wrong is good, maybe like a really important trait. But it's many of these things are like little paradoxes. Like it's really important to be willing to be wrong, but it's really important not to give up too quickly. So yeah, maybe managing paradox itself is a good skill in startups that you can like deal with that kind of confusing story. Those are really important. Obviously, being willing to work very hard and being very serious about work is good. But I think that there's just really a lot of different kinds of successful people in startups. Whether it's like, I wouldn't want to. I would be careful to generalize. I don't know. I think know
there's some things you can generalize and others you can't. So, for example, I would totally agree with you that what kind of person does well at startup, at a minimum, depends upon what your role is. It'll be very different if you're trying to be CEO or if you're a technical person or you're a marketing person. Those types of different job descriptions have very different personalities and very different types of people. So, I think it depends a lot, right?
Yeah, and I think that like we were sort of saying earlier, like there's startups, a lot of starting a new company, any new company is about wearing a lot of different hats, and so and you have to have the right people around the table to have all the hats that fit on everyone. I don't know, this metaphor might be pushing it. So if you're going to make sure that all the hats fit all the people around the table, yes, you have to have someone who can attend to detail very carefully. You have to have someone who is good at hiring. You have to have someone who is good at evaluating the finances, of course. But I don't know if that can be hard for a self-assessment, right? Like, or even for someone else to assess. If I had asked Zach, do you think we were friends in college? Zach, do you think I would be a good person to start a company? I don't know what he would have said. Maybe I guess he would have said yes.
Well, let's ask him. What do you think, Zach?
Yes.
But we were business managers together, so I guess he saw some of that. But I don't think like I wouldn't be able to go through my friends and say good entrepreneur, but bad entrepreneur. No, I don't know how to say that.
Yeah, Diana, you want to comment at all about that issue?
Sure. So I again agree with what John said about all of that, and something else that I think jumping off something that Zach said earlier was risk tolerance, more in terms of you don't have a path plan for you at all, so you have to be okay with just like not having any direction. You can talk to 50 mentors, 100 mentors, you're going to get 100 different paths. And you just have to be okay knowing that you're kind of blazing your own trail. And like you said earlier, that you're going to make mistakes, that you're going to have to go back and try something else. And I think that some people are more okay with than others. And if you're not okay with not having a roadmap, I think it'd be a little bit more difficult to be an entrepreneur. That being said, I'm sure, if you set your mind to it, you can probably get over it anyway, but it'd just be a little bit more.
Yeah, that's so right on. And I actually think it can be that we all contain multitudes. I mean, I think when I was a PhD student, I was very much the kind of PhD student who expected to be told what to do. And then like somehow I woke up and realized that actually the best part about being an entrepreneur is that you have to ignore what people tell you to do and decide what you want to do.
Or not wait around for them to tell you what to do and just go do it. Yeah. And you know, I would also add, I think it's important to define our terms here when we say startup, right? Is Uber a startup at this point? Not really, but you know, sometimes people would call it that, or you know, even a company with a few dozen people, is that a startup? I mean, if you have an HR manager, I mean, John, you don't have one yet, right? So you have to do that all yourself. But you know,
Right.
if you know, let's say if your company gets big enough and so maybe you have 50 people, you have an HR manager, and so if you say, well, you know, I want to be an HR manager. You know, do I want to go to a big company or a startup? Well, if you're an HR manager and you're going to a startup, it's probably not really a startup anymore because they're hiring an HR manager. It's somewhere along the continuum, right? It's toward, you know, whatever you want to call it, just, you know, regular business. So then it becomes, well, I want to be an HR manager. You know, I want to just have a set salary in a big company, or, you know, I want to be an HR manager at sort of like a young company, whatever you want to call it, a startup. Maybe I take a little less pay and I you know, I get a little more equity on the back end. I think that's, you know, to kind of go back to my earlier point about, you know, this Web 2.0 or whatever you want to call it, these companies are not companies that the average person can invest in. And so I know people have taken jobs at Spotify because they say, well, you know, I really believe in this company and I want to invest in it. And the only way I can do that is to go work there and to get options, or, you know, or get what have you. And I would like to work there anyway. So it kind of comes down to, you know, how much do you believe in the company, and even in that middle range, you know, how much risk are you willing to take on versus, you know, a startup where there are 3 people and everybody's kind of wearing all these different hats, and, you know, John is the CEO and the salesman and the head of HR all at once. You know, totally different kind of scenario.
Let me ask a third question, which is, what are some of the things that you think are myths about the startups versus realities? And you know, I ask this for all of them because that's part of the premise of the series, which is there are pretty much every profession has some myths about it, right? And you know, I mean, the example I gave at the beginning, which is forensic science. Well, the myth is that it's really sexy, and the reality is it's being in a lab and doing repetitive stuff over and over again, you know, without sexy lighting and LED screens and so forth. And that's the reality of what police forensic work is, right? Versus the myth. Any comment on myths versus realities with regard to startups?
Yeah. There are a lot of startup myths. Zach, Zach, did you want to say something? Looks like you're about to say something.
I was going to say, I think Bacchanal orgies, there was a big piece in Vanity Fair about how every startup in San Francisco is just this, you know, teeming mass of horrible, you know, disgusting Bacchanal orgy parties. And
it's not true.
From all the entrepreneurs, all the entrepreneurs I talked to were like, "What? No."
Oh, Diana, I guess you might as well resign, right?
Yeah, not quite what we signed up for.
I mean, I would say that, like, if you go to San Francisco and you interviewed 100 startup employees off the street, and that would be pretty easy, you would hear a lot of myths that are not true. They would tell you, like, it's not that sexy. No one gets rich. Everything fails. The crazy companies that seem like they're successful die all the time. It's sort of like, I don't know if you can still hear me. Sorry, there's a passing car. It's sort of like, yeah, you've just sort of never made it until it happens. And I think that there's just like a lot of frothy excitement about startups that they're just companies at the end of the day, and they're filled when they're small and you have access to the decision makers, or you're one of them, and you get to make some of those exciting discoveries and decide what the business model should be, or in which direction the company should. It is really exciting, but it's exciting in a sort of normal way. And I think there's just a lot of myth making that occurs in the press, especially. Sorry, Zach, about like how great it's going to be and how you're going to change the world. And at the end of the day, you're solving problems for people. You might create some joy. You might do something really exciting. But I think joining a startup to change the world is the scariest myth that you should be the most skeptical of, and just use your own compass about like, is this thing creating value? Is it good? And try and work on good things. But yeah, it's most startups spend a lot of money and fail horribly. So that's why we're talking about risk so much.
They might do better than the failure rate of restaurants in New York City, but maybe only a little bit better, right?
Yeah, I think it might be kind of similar.
Yeah, exactly. Diana, any myths?
So I think the failure one is definitely one of the top ones, where you only hear about the ones that succeed. You don't hear about the vast majority that fail. But I think another one is people sometimes want to join startups because they don't want to work for someone. They don't want a boss telling them what to do. But in actuality, once you have a startup, especially if you're one of the people leading it, you end up having a lot of bosses. So it's your customers, it's your investors, it's everyone who has an opinion becomes your boss, essentially. So instead of managing expectations of one or two people, you're now managing expectations of everyone. Even your employees essentially are your bosses, to be completely honest.
Yeah.
And going back to the something that John mentioned, the unglamorous work. So, you go in thinking, I'm going to change the world, I'm going to work on this one problem. But instead you find yourselves reading tax codes to make sure you don't get dinged by the IRS. You find yourself doing all of this really not or less exciting work.
Wait. I'm in investment banking. I love reading the tax code. I wouldn't overgeneralize about this.
That's true. Yeah, my apologies. So you might want to find a partner who loves the tax code. But you're
taking panels from the streets of Palo Alto, and it's not all fancy offices.
No, but I think those are really good points. I think particularly this idea. You're absolutely right, which is thinking that if you start your own company, that you're the boss. You just have a different bosses, right? Than you had before, right? By the way, I want to make one comment, which is one of the things I've observed, having talked to so many people in startups, including the ones that have been very successful, is a very significant percentage of them end up doing something very different from what they started doing. Example is Snapchat. Snapchat, they started so forth. They were doing something totally different, and it was failing. But they just said, "Well, okay, that didn't work." But of the things that we have developed this far, is there something we could do that would be useful, right? And then they figured out they could based on that, and then they created Snapchat, right? If they had just stopped, it would have been a failure. It doesn't mean that if you keep changing, you'll ultimately be successful. But it really goes back to what Diana said, which, by the way, Diana, you have remarkable number of good comments, given that you've just started a startup, is that there's a lot of, changing direction based on being attuned to what you're doing that's not working or is working, and then making intelligent changes, based on that, right? And Snapchat, they made a lot of money, right? They did quite well, but they had no idea that was what they were going to do originally, right? Any other comments on this myths issue?
I would throw in, if you want to go work for a startup because you feel like your time will be your own and you don't have everybody, lording over your time, and you have all this freedom. Sure, maybe you don't have to be at the same desk all the time, and maybe you can work wherever you want and come and go as you please, but you have more work because it's all on you, and even if nobody is telling you be here and do this right now, at the end of the day, you still have to do it, and there's more of it. So, you may find yourself, actually spending more time than you would at a desk job, a regular desk job.
One piece of advice I would give is that if you're contemplating either doing a startup or you're deciding whether to join a startup, take someone who's worked for a little while, who's run a business or is a successful business, and just ask them as a favor, saying, let me tell you what I'm thinking of doing, or let me tell you about the company that I'm thinking of joining. And it doesn't have to be someone who's 40, 50 years old. It could be someone who's, 30, 35, who's worked at a small company, whatever, and therefore has some idea what makes a company successful. It's really helpful. I mean, my son, who just graduated from Yale, but when he started 2 companies in high school, and I served that function for him. I basically sat down, and he asked me, he said, okay, what do you think about this? And I told him the honest opinion about what seemed to make sense and didn't. And he actually listened, which probably means there was something wrong, right? However, by the way, I am his unpaid CFO and have been for 7 years. And I keep asking for a raise, and he won't give me one. So, that's not working very well. But, the thing that was helpful was that I could sort of tell him stuff that didn't really quite make sense, right? Or I could warn him about stuff that he hadn't thought about, right? And like with some contracts he was negotiating, he just didn't have the experience, right? So I said, well, at least these 3 things, make sure you have in the contract. If you don't, then you got a problem. And so he focused on it, right? So I would strongly encourage people, whether you're joining a startup thing or you want to do a startup, get someone who's, not old, but maybe has been around for 5, 10 years, had some experience, and just say, hey, look, do me a favor, tell me, what's your reaction to what I'm thinking I'm doing, right? And I think that's very helpful, right? So one other thing is, there's this whole thing about, I think, John, you raised this issue about people wanting to get into things that are socially responsible and so forth. And, can any of you comment about this issue of, do startups make sense or don't make sense when it comes to things like social responsibility kinds of things, apps that, there's a real startup that takes food from Indian family weddings that go on for a week and redistributes to the poor, so forth, so on. Now that's a useful societal function, but I doubt that it'll be an IPO, right? So forth. So can people make some observations, because there are huge amount of, quote, socially useful startups that are going on that a lot of students are attracted to, right? Any comments about that? I'm sure, Diana, you have a whole host of your fellow classmates who are all excited about something about whatever, right? Political action or this or that or whatever, right?
Sure. If you want, I can start with that. So I think I'm actually one of the outliers in my class in pursuing something that is oil and gas. The majority of my classmates are doing more socially responsible or socially geared startups. And I think it's a really good field to go into. I think there's a lot of benefit for society by doing startups or apps or programs like that. But kind of more from a big picture side, I don't think necessarily, at least from my view, it's a new thing. It's just that now technology has enabled that to be, like a technology platform. But all throughout history, people have been doing nonprofits. People have been, doing small businesses that do similar things. And I think just the way that technology has developed, it's a new venue to, get those social missions done. And like you said, it might not end up an IPO, but it's still going to help society overall. And I think that's a good thing.
And you just have to realize what the end point is really going to look like, right? I guess.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. John, you brought that topic up, so I'm sure you have a thought.
I don't have much more to add. I think social entrepreneurship is great. I think with either social entrepreneurship and for-profit businesses that are explicitly for-profit, it's definitely just really important to think about business model in both cases and make sure that you're not telling yourself a story. That applies equally to for-profit businesses. Like, if it's supposed to be donor funded, that's great. Then, thinking about donor funding. If it's supposed to be grant funded, that's great. If it's supposed to be a self-sustaining model in the sense of like, the people who are helped fund the social benefit in some way, that's interesting. And, you have to make sure you're doing it ethically, but I don't have much more to add. It's just, I think sometimes the most important thing is just make sure you're not kidding yourself about the plan. And yeah, of course, that you're not trying to get rich off it if it's a not-for-profit. But yeah, I think there's a lot of well-intentioned people, and they're great. And so it's just, I think it's as challenging, if not more challenging, to start a good, successful social entrepreneurship enterprise. So I would just encourage people to be candid about how hard it is.
Zach, do you have any comments at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this maybe gets outside of the social entrepreneurship a little bit, but I think there's just a fixation on growth. Our profits are up, our revenues are up, we raised a bigger round than last time, higher valuation, and whatever the case may be. And I think there's something to be said for businesses that are steady and that are profitable but aren't growing like crazy, or that are just reliable companies that plod along, and maybe they have a social element and maybe they don't, but I think societally, I think it's important to remember that not everything could go up all the time, and that there should be a niche for things that are kind of more on that kind of like stable middle level.
Actually, Zach, I'll comment. I went to Yale undergrad, but I went to Harvard Business School, and the first case that we did was one which was a great eye opener for the students. To give this case about this company, and you were supposed to analyze them, and at the end of saying, what's wrong with this company? And you read it's growing, it had a very successful product, and everything else, and so forth. So everybody came to the first class saying, the professor said, okay, you, John, what do you think? Oh, I don't know. I can't think of anything wrong with this company. So forth. And he got to the fourth student, and the fourth student said, the problem with that company is it's going bankrupt. And the professor said, that's exactly right. He said, it's exactly the point, which is you got to look at all of the pieces, right? So maybe some things look very appealing and it's growing and so forth. I have a contract about Uber. Uber, I think, is in serious trouble because the economics, it's not as bad as the dumplings, but it's bad. And it's bad because they can't make money. Because between what the drivers need, what they can charge customers, what they have to pay the drivers, and then the regulatory costs and everything else, and then the ganging up of the cities that are against them for all sorts of reasons. And, right now, it's not clear what the future is for Uber. Getting big is not necessarily a formula for success, right? Like Tesla, let's see whether this guy can stop losing $1 billion, every quarter, right? The famous story from Catch 22, Milo Minderbender. There's a famous scene where he says, "I'm selling eggs, and I buy them for 3 cents and I sell them for 2 cents." And the main character says, "Well, how do you make money?" He says, "I make it up in the volume." So, I think that's a great story to sort of say, look at the basic premise, because just because you can get customers doesn't mean, that you're, going to be successful. Elon Musk may actually be, his big success may be actually in the, space launchers, right? Because the government will pay $300 million for each launch. It costs you $100 million to build the thing. You can count the margin, right? So, and if you can get the rockets to come back and land, right, every once in a while, the cost goes down. So that may turn out to be a bigger success than making, cars and making it up in the volume, which is basically what he's doing. Let's open it up to questions here. I'm going to remind the audience that the way you ask a question is you go to the chat function. And we also have some people here in the audience here in this room and in the room next door. So the first question is from, it says, "Hello, my name is Farisa, and I am a freshman from Yale NYS College. I am interested in social entrepreneurship." Oh, there we go. "And sustainable projects." There's a second word. "My intended academic major is biological sciences, though, and I think I heard John, this is for you, say that he did astrophysics at Harvard. I wanted to ask, how do you think your academic background helped you in developing your startup? Okay, John, you're on. How did your
Okay.
your
Can you hear me
academic
okay?
career help you do your startup? Whoops, we're losing you.
Well,
Oh, there we go.
do you
Okay,
have
we're
me
back.
now? Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think there's different situations for that. I mean, in my case, it didn't really. I mean, except just in being sort of a more. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, now we can now.
Yeah.
Now we can.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't think my startup is particularly related to.
Yeah, I think your connection, your internet connection is not so good. Well, let's wait a minute, see if because we could tell your connection's not so good. Let's wait for a minute and let's ask if anyone here in the audience has a question for any of the panelists. And then we'll go back to you, John. Anyone here? Yes? No?
I'm actually just getting into like the startup industry. I just came over from marketing and cryptocurrency for a little while. Now I'm starting a company. And I hear a lot about startups in tech and in the tech space, and even for education, it's ed tech. Everything's trying to get the internet and all that stuff involved. My company is teaching music lessons, and we have a little bit of tech. It's going to be some databases online and that sort of thing, but it's not as flashy and sexy as a lot of the stuff is now. Like, how do you fit that in what people think of as a startup today, if it's not the Web 2.0 techie drones kind of thing?
Okay. The question, someone here, let me repeat it. He's involved with a startup which is teaching music, but it's not necessarily based on a whole bunch of technology and so forth. So is there any comment that anyone would have about startups that are not necessarily focused on technology, right?
Oh,
Yeah,
I can jump in. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question because you see a lot of companies now that are not really tech startups that are sort of marketing themselves as startups. So like a company like some of the beverage companies like from Bai or Vitamin Water or Aqua Hydrate or some of these companies describe themselves as startups. You find them on Crunchbase. They have some of the usual suspects in Silicon Valley who invest in them, but it's just more of how you want to market yourself, I think. And I think I guess it's it's as long as you're honest with yourself about what you want your company to do, you can kind of embrace the startup label, and kind of go with that, or say no, this is a regular business, and I want to market it as such. But maybe even if it's not a pure tech startup, you could still choose to market it as such if you feel like that would help you get the kind of traction you want.
Yeah, the reality is all this should really be independent of technology, because the reality is there's so many good businesses that succeed that have nothing to do with technology. It's just a really good idea or really good service or so forth. So I really do think that although it happens to be that two of the panelists are involved with technology, the reality is, Diana has nothing to do with the internet, right? The last thing I checked, your devices don't use the internet at all. John's happens to be, but I think you have to sort of get away from the idea that internet and technology is key, because the reality is it really doesn't matter. You could have a good idea that has nothing to do with technology that will be, tremendously successful, right? Well, we are
Jumping off of that real fast. So I think another thing, it's going back to something I said earlier, where a lot of entrepreneurs actually do not do technology, like Peter said. And as an example, one of our mentors, one of our most valuable mentors, he started a welding company that he views as a startup, but they don't do any technology. And then he said that his mentor that helped him started a dentist's office. So I think a lot of these lessons are irregardless of whether you use technology or not, and they can be transferred between industries.
Yeah. I'll give you one example. My firm. we started 23 years ago. Two reasons. One is because I got very upset about what it was like to be at Lehman Brothers, running a group there because of all the politics and all the conflicts and so forth. But the other is, it occurred to me that there was a logic for why a boutique could be successful in investment banking. And going back to some of the older style, that these investment banks have become very large, so a lot of their ability to serve clients have been impaired by the way they're structured. So it's interesting. I remember starting the firm, people said, why do you think you're going to be able to compete against these large investment banks? First client was Henkel. Second client was Bayer. So I got confused. I said, Jesus, I thought I would do middle market clients. And it really came down to a validation of the fact that the things that I was unhappy about at the large investment bank was also creating unhappiness by not all, but many clients. So essentially, it was a startup. The company didn't exist before. Was based on a business model that was based on a shift in the structure of investment banking. So back to what you say, had nothing to do with technology, right? Right. We do actually use computers, but it has nothing to do with how the business operates. So I can assure you, if you have the right concept, but the key there was understanding that the market was shifting and that there was a deficiency of how certain investment banks, the traditional ones, were serving their clients, right? So it's a good illustration, right? Although I like the idea of teaching music, I love music, so that's a great idea, right? We have a question here. Diane here, ex-BlackRock, now a VC investor. So 2 questions. From an investment perspective, what do you think of pre-IPO deals? Valuation is obviously high, and many people are concerned with another potential downturn. Number 2, any views on blockchain and ICOs? As a startup, would you choose to launch an ICO instead of raising money from a traditional VCs? Anyone want to tackle either one of those questions? I'm not sure we have any blockchain experts here, so that may be the problem. But I will say one thing, which is that there is right now a theory that perhaps the pre-IPO valuations may be a bit ahead of themselves. So, I mean, you comment probably on these unicorns, that
Sure.
maybe some of the people who've invested in these last rounds at some of these companies may find themselves losing money. But that's just based on reading. Do you have any comment?
Well, I would say broadly in terms of pre-IPO deals, I mean, it just depends on the company. And, you see something like Uber. I think Uber, the last round they raised was at a lower valuation from the previous round. So, I think it just depends on the company. And then in terms of blockchain and ICOs, not a crypto expert myself, but I do see, a lot of things like a lot of entertainers are developing startups and they're funding with ICOs. Which to me is kind of a sign that things are really frothy, I'm a little wary of it. I mean,
if Jay-Z's doing it, maybe it's overboard, right?
Well, if Jay-Z's doing it, then it's probably a good idea. But, it's when you start to see these like C and D-list celebrities doing ICOs, and you're like, wait, what is going on here? So, look, hey, maybe it's good for them as an investor. I'm not putting any money into any celebrity ICOs. So.
But by the way, blockchain is a big deal, and it's really going to change a lot of the world. So if you're not knowledgeable, do a little bit of reading. It's going to change a lot of different. And I actually went through and visited the top 10 blockchain firms serving the financial services industry about a year ago. It's amazing what it can do. So so that's certainly an area where there'll be a lot of successes. So with that, we'd like to end, and the first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to thank our 3 panelists and thank them for being terrific in helping the audience understand some of these questions better. We want to wish Diana every good luck, and if your robot can clean my apartment, my wife and I will be very grateful. The last thing I want to mention is the next Yale Career Panel is going to be on April 10th on journalism and publishing. And so we'll be sending a notice and invitations out. But Trish Takamoto is putting that together, and we've got some really good panelists. we're lining up. So those of you who are interested, please join. And last, this is recorded, so and sometime in the next couple of days, it'll be uploaded to the Yale Career Panels.com, so that if you really liked what Zach and Diana and John said and you want to watch again, like a really good movie, you're going to have the opportunity. All right. So thank you very much. And I want to thank all the panelists again. And thank you for all of you in the audience for attending.